Welcome back. I know some of you guys were out of town and some people are still out of town, but regardless, again, happy Lunar New Year, or so welcome back to those of you that are here. We are continuing in our series in the Gospel of Mark, and we're now on chapter 5. And so just to start off today, the question I have is, do you believe in the supernatural? Do you believe in the supernatural? Got a couple of head nods, a couple of blank stares, a couple of people that are just kind of, what's going on? Because, what we're going to get into in the text today, there's a lot of supernatural things that are going to happen. Okay, so just think about that. Do I believe in the supernatural? Do I believe in the spiritual? I definitely, growing up in the States, this would be a much more controversial question over there. But one that I think Koreans in general have more of an openness to, but it's changing, I've noticed. It's changing over the years. It's that there's more of a Western influence here in Korea where it's starting to shift here as well. But regardless, think about that. We're going to go into the text, Mark 5. Open your Bible, smartphones, or look at the screen, Mark 5, starting from verse 1. Where the Lord says this: They went across the lake to the region of the Gerasenes. When Jesus got out of the boat, a man with an impure spirit came from the tombs to meet him. This man lived in the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain. For he had often been chained hand and foot, but he tore the chains apart and broke the irons on his feet. No one was strong enough to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and in the hills he would cry out and cut himself with stones. When he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and fell on his feet in front of him. He shouted at the top of his voice, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? In God's name, don't torture me." For Jesus had said to him, "Come out of this man, you impure spirit." Then Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" "My name is Legion," he replied, "for we are many." And he begged Jesus again and again not to send them out of the area. A large herd of pigs was feeding on the nearby hillside. The demons begged Jesus, "Send us among the pigs, allow us to go into them." He gave them permission, and the impure spirits came out and went into the pigs. The herd, about 2,000 in number, rushed down the steep bank into the lake and were drowned. Those tending the pigs ran off and reported this in the town and countryside, and the people went out to see what had happened. When they came to Jesus, they saw the man who had been possessed by the legion of demons sitting there, dressed and in his right mind, and they were afraid. Those who had seen it told the people what happened to the demon-possessed man, and told about the pigs as well. Then the people began to plead with Jesus to leave their region. As Jesus was getting into the boat, the man who had been demon-possessed begged to go with him. Jesus did not let him, but said, "Go home to your own people and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you." So the man went away and began to tell in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and all the people were amazed. When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue leaders named Jairus came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." So Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed and pressed around him, and a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had, yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. Immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once, Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" "You see the people crowding against you," his disciples answered, "and yet you can ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." While Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. "Your daughter is dead," they said. "Why bother the teacher anymore?" Overhearing what they said, Jesus told him, "Don't be afraid, just believe." He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they had came to the house of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, "Why all this commotion and wailing? This child is not dead, but asleep." But they laughed at him. After he put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him and went in with the child, where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha kum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." Immediately the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. At this they were completely astonished. He gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this and told them to give her something to eat. Amen. Long passage, but there's a lot going on there, and actually there's a very kind of a central theme. Now again, 2017, the theme for this year is the gospel of freedom. And so the hope and the declaration for all of us here is that we would experience more freedom in our lives, that whatever suffering, bondage, difficulties that we have, that God would help us to experience more freedom in this year. Now, we've been going through the Gospel of Mark, and we see again that the Gospel of Mark is interesting because it's very short in that it's the shortest of all the Gospels. But we understand that this was written to a crowd that was going through a very difficult season. These were Christians that were getting persecuted. This was under the time of Nero. And so there's a reason why it's written so succinctly, because Mark was just trying to get his message across as quickly as possible. And he's explaining who Jesus is and what he has done. And we saw previously in chapter 2 that Jesus desires to heal us at every single level, whether it's a physical or spiritual level. He was healing in that chapter. And then we see in chapter 3 that Jesus continues in spite of opposition from his own family and from the scholars of the law who were calling him crazy and were calling him demon-possessed. Jesus presses on. And last week we saw that Jesus used parables. He used these stories to teach. And through those stories he talked about the seed, which is really the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ. And teaching us to trust in that seed, the power of the seed, and for us to just be good sowers, to scatter that seed wherever we go. Now, the title of the message is power, and the Greek word for power is dunamis. It's where we get the word dynamite from. And so dunamis it only shows up once in this chapter, but we saw from last week that Jesus starts showing up with these amazing miracles. So last week at the end of the chapter, after all these parables, Jesus calms the storm, right? The storm is going on, and the disciples are afraid that they're going to die. They wake up Jesus, and he's like, "Okay, peace, be still." And he controls nature. So he shows power over nature. And what we're going to see is this is actually the first of, I believe, 10 miracles in a row. And so for the next few chapters, it's just going to be a series of miracles with different narratives in between. And here we have 3 different miracles just in this chapter alone. And the first thing that he shows is his power over demonic powers. Right? So there is this man who is possessed not by one spirit, but we find out by many. Right? Maybe up to 2,000 or more. Right? Thousands. They call themselves legion. Right? It's more than one. Now, here's the thing is, a lot of people question when they read these stories in the Bible, especially in like the States and in the Western mind, like, is this real? Like, what is a demon-possessed person? Like, those don't exist. They're crazy. And so, I'll try to say this as very briefly as I can. I took a abnormal psychology class when I was in seminary. And it was interesting because, I have a very Western perspective, but I have a very decent understanding of the Eastern perspective, having Korean parents and having lived here for some time. And as I was studying it, abnormal psychology, it's talking about the different definitions of abnormalities, right? Especially like mental abnormalities, people that have delusion, people that are like manic depressive, bipolar disorder, all these different things. Is going through the different definitions of that. And I remembered as I was studying it, a thought came to my mind, is that what the West defines as like a mental disorder, right? In the East, it would be defined as something spiritual. So if you took someone and you took the Western definition and you're like, okay, this guy's bipolar, blah, 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 and he's showing all these different traits, you take that same person over to an Eastern area and they would be like, this man is demon-possessed. And so I realized that there's kind of something interesting about that. But one of the things I also realized is that when you look at the West and people that have mental disorders, bipolar, whatever it is that they tend to follow the definition that's in the book, right? The DSM, that's what they call it, the thing that defines what these disorders are. But when you go to the East, that same person who has these same traits often has extra things, like supernatural, like strength, like throwing people across the room. You see that more in the East than you see in the West. And I started to realize is that, now it's kind of a weird thought, but I started to get into thought of, what if I were Satan? And what if I were like trying to use like these type of things to scare people away from the faith? How would I do it? Now, understanding that the West, it's a very dry area spiritually, because of honestly, the modern era, the scientific era, made the West much more analytical. And so you see the kind of the decline of spirituality, but in the East, it's changing, as I've said before, but there's still a level of dependency on the spiritual. And so I think the spiritual atmosphere is different in the West and in the East. And what I noticed was these same things in the West, it follows the definition. In the East, it shows supernatural power. And I realized that for whatever reason, it seems like these things follow, like, there seems like there's like laws, like spiritual laws, that when it's in this type of environment, it only functions as this, and if it's in this environment, it functions as this. And when I thought about this in the mind of Satan, if I'm Satan, what I want people to believe in the West is that I don't exist and God doesn't exist. So I will attack people in a way that you can define clinically, and they're like, oh, this is a medical condition. It's not a spiritual attack. Whereas in the East, where people are scared by the spiritual, I would make it as spiritual as possible so people are just scared and afraid. Okay? And I started to realize that Satan was using the same tactics, but he's using it in different environments. And so that's what I started to see. And then to piggyback off this, now, you guys like horror movies? I don't. I really don't. I know some of you do. I know someone likes the Saw series, but he likes the first one the best. I don't know, it's something weird with him. But anyway, and if Justin was here, Justin would get excited too, because Justin loves horror movies too. I don't know, something wrong with these kids. But to me, what I think is the most scary horror movie that I've ever seen is The Exorcist. Have you guys seen The Exorcist? So, you know, The Exorcist is actually based off of an allegedly true story of a young child that was demon-possessed and what happened to her, right? And I remember as a kid, like, this movie would just mess me up. We just don't watch this movie, okay? Just forget I talked about it, okay? Watch, I don't know, Pororo or something like that. But this movie, like, it scared the heck out of me. And part of the reason why is because I lived in an area close to where it actually happened. It happened in Georgetown, which was like maybe about 40 minutes away from where I lived. And so I was like, man, like this is scary. Like, this is really scary. And I remember as I'm watching this movie, my dad comes in. And I'm like, uh-oh, what's my dad gonna do? He's gonna yell at me for watching this movie. And he comes in, he's like, what is this? And I was like, this is The Exorcist. He's like, really? And then like he notices there's like a priest up there that's like doing the exorcism, like throwing holy water and stuff like that. And he sits down and he's like really excited. And I'm like, what's going on? And he's like cheering for the priest. And I'm like, what's going on? And so he ends up telling me the story about how my dad, I think this was right after he got married. Right after my dad got married, he was very involved with CCC. And so he became a CCC staff member here in Korea. And he was sent to Jeju, the Jeju island, to start CCC. So my father actually started CCC in Jeju. And when he goes there, like nobody would listen to him. He was going around trying to evangelize and trying to share the gospel with people, and no one would listen. But there was apparently a demon-possessed man in that neighborhood. And so my dad and a couple of his friends, they went and they kept praying for this man. And he said over time, like, he didn't really explain how long, like the man was like, the demon left him. And after that, that's how he was able to plant CCC, because all of a sudden, like, people started to listen to the gospel after they saw what him and his friends were able to do. So my dad's like, I've done this. This guy doesn't know what he's doing. And so for me, like that was actually a very shocking story for me, because I'd never heard anything like that from my father. But my father, in his youth, like this was back when he was in his 20s, he claims to have partaken of an exorcism. And that was actually what allowed him to do the ministry that he was doing in Jeju Island. And so for me, like, it hits home because, and also like my sister in college, she was actually involved in KCCC in New York City, and she was actually at Columbia University. And turns out that, I think it was like her roommate was a very strong Christian, but she had a demon possession. And like did weird things like in the middle of the night. And so like my sister like kind of scared me when she was talking about this, so she didn't complete the story. So I really don't know what happened. But apparently this was something my sister dealt with when she was in college. And so I've never personally, I've seen a couple of things, but it hasn't really been that personal for me. But at the same time, like, so many people around me have witnessed it and partaken in seeing, like, the demonic, and through the power of Jesus being able to combat it. And so, when I look at the story, it's just like Jesus is showing that he has complete authority over the demonic. And from what I've seen, it's true. That even through the name of Jesus, we ourselves can also exercise power over the demonic when we do it in the name of Jesus. Now, as I was going through this story, this is a story that most of you should be very familiar with, right? The story of Legion. But as I was going through the story, a fact that never dawned on me hit me. And that's when it says that he was from Gerasenes. Gerasenes is not in Israel. It's actually pretty far away. And it's actually an area where no Jews lived. And then I should have known this earlier, because when you look at the story, it talks about how he goes off and he spreads the name of Jesus in the Decapolis. The Decapolis means in Greek 10 cities. That's not in Israel. So this guy is going around talking about Jesus outside of Israel. And the other thing is, they're pigs. What do Jewish people not eat? Pigs. It's actually illegal to take care of a pig. You can't even have a pet pig in Israel. So why would there be 2,000 pigs? This is not Israel, right? So what is going on is Jesus crosses the lake and he ends up in an area that's not part of his own country. And these are strangers and foreigners to them. And this man is possessed with thousands of demons. Brothers and sisters, this man was a lost cause. Not only was he not from his own people, he wasn't a Jewish person, this man had thousands of demons inside of him. But Jesus still had compassion on him. And so this was what blew my mind, was I never knew this man was a Gentile. Jesus could have just turned the boat around and said, okay guys, let's go back. Like, I'm not gonna deal with this. But Jesus showed compassion on someone who honestly, anyone else would have just said, okay, it's okay to let this man go. So in this first story, we are seeing when Jesus sees someone in such a difficult situation, a man that didn't know God, who is just haunted by thousands of demons, and is cutting himself and doing all these terrible things, Jesus showed compassion and showed his power by releasing this man of the bondage that he was under. Now, as you go on in the story, Jesus goes around, and then this man Jairus, who's a synagogue leader, this is a man of social standing. This is basically like your upper class Jew, right? This guy has a terrible thing happening to his daughter. His daughter is sick, and he thinks in his mind, if Jesus puts his hands on my daughter, she will be healed. So he shows faith. He believes. He believes that the simple touch of Jesus will heal his daughter. And so he goes, and this is a man of resource and reputation, and he goes and says, okay, Jesus, I know that you can heal my daughter. Please come with me. And so Jesus starts following him, right? Now, while he's going, there's this woman who's been bleeding for 12 years, right? That must suck. Bleeding for 12 years. This is a woman who's been going through suffering for a long time. And her belief is that, you know what? If I just touch the clothes of Jesus, I will be healed. He doesn't need to touch me. He doesn't even need to know that I'm there. If I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. So she's showing an even greater amount of faith. And that's what happens. She touches the very clothes of Jesus. Now for her, if you bleed, you're considered ceremonially unclean. Okay? I actually experienced this when I was in Indonesia. When I was in Indonesia, it was during Ramadan, right? Ramadan's crazy. Like the whole country, they're all fasting during the day. They're pigging out at 3 a.m. and when they wake up in the morning, it's a weird so when the sun goes down, they pig out, and then they wake up before the sun comes up and they pig out, and then during the day, you're not even supposed to drink water or whatever. So it's a weird thing. It's a very unusual season, and then the whole day, people, all the mosques, they're broadcasting all these loud prayers, very loud and obnoxious, all day long. But what I noticed was some we were with actually a lot of girls. We were with this Korean culture club, and these girls were dressed normally, and they were eating like us, and we're like, what's going on? Is it okay? And they're like, yeah, don't worry about it. And I found out later, it's because they were all on their period. So because they were on their period, they were considered ceremonially unclean, so they didn't have to fast during Ramadan. Right? So that's a law that exists even for Muslims too, just the same for Jews. When you are going through your period, when you are bleeding, again, we didn't talk this. When this is happening, you're considered ceremonially unclean, right? And so you're not allowed to go to the temple, you're not allowed to worship there until it stops. And so this woman had been doing this for 12 years. So she had a sickness. And you see from the passage that it was very painful. But not only that, it would keep her out of society. She wasn't allowed to go to the temple. And actually, her touching Jesus, her touching anyone, because she was ceremonially unclean, she was making them unclean too. So what she was doing was actually unlawful. But this was the struggle that she had been going through for 12 years. Imagine this, 12 years, you're physically hurting, no one can fix you, and then you can't partake of anything else. You're basically an outcast. This must have been a very rough season for this woman. But Jesus says, your faith has healed you, verse 34. It's not, touching my clothes, that healed you. No, it's not that at all. It's the simple fact that she believed. She believed that Jesus could heal her. And it was her faith that healed her. Now during this time, unfortunately, during all this commotion, Jairus' daughter dies, right? Before Jesus can get over there. And already they're saying, you know what? Don't bother the teacher anymore. It's over. Let it go. And how does Jesus respond? He says, don't be afraid, just believe. So in the woman's case, you have a woman that has been going through suffering for a long period of time. And yet she still has faith. And now you have a very tragic event. Something that seems impossible to fix. And Jesus' answer to this is, don't be afraid. Just believe. And so what we see here, and what we've seen throughout all the Gospels, honestly, is that whenever Jesus heals someone, usually there is an act of faith beforehand. In some cases, the faith is not of the person that's being healed. Like in the case where there are those friends that bring their paralyzed friend and they dig a hole in the roof and they drop him down. That passage talks about the faith of the friends. We don't know anything about the paralyzed man. But Jesus healed because he saw the faith of the friends. Here in this passage, Jesus heals this bleeding woman because she believed that simply touching the clothes of Jesus would heal her. And here, when we see Jesus bringing the daughter back to life, it's because he challenged Jairus, who already believed that Jesus could heal his daughter if she was alive. Keep believing, trust in me, and I will do this. We saw this also in just this past weekend when we were going through the Gospel of John in chapter 9, where Jesus asked this man that he had born, this man who was born blind, who has been given his sight back. The first thing Jesus asks him when he sees him is, "Do you believe?" Jesus wants us to have faith in him. If there's one requirement for us to experience freedom, to experience healing in our lives, it's for us to believe in Jesus. That's the one requirement. Now in some cases, on the other hand, in that first story, of the story of Legion, that man is not a Jew. That man does not believe in God. That man is as far from Jesus as possible, but Jesus still had compassion on him. So one thing I want to remind you is, there are days when you don't want to have faith. There are days when you don't want to believe. But Jesus will still have compassion on you, especially if you're going through something. But even so, no matter what you're going through, whether you are going through something like the woman where you have been going through suffering for many, many years, and there's something in your life that you haven't been able to overcome, and you've been trying to fix it no matter what, and it's still not getting any better. If you're going through that kind of season, the answer is the same. Don't be afraid, just believe. Or like Jairus, if you have a very tragic event happen to you, his daughter is sick, she dies. It seems like game over. Maybe some of you have had a similar tragic experience, or maybe going through it right now. The answer is the same. Don't be afraid. Just believe. What Jesus is showing in this chapter, and as well as the previous chapter, is that he has power over nature, demons, sickness, and even death. That dunamis, that power that he talked about, that was taken from him by that woman, is greater than all of these different things. We will see in other passages that he will show power at a larger scale, feeding 5,000 and all these different things. But here in this chapter, it's all about individuals. A man with demons, a woman who'd been bleeding for 12 years, and a man whose daughter had just died. These are all individuals. And so really the challenge for us today, and as I want to remind us what our theme is for the year, the theme for the year again is the gospel of freedom, for us to experience freedom in a way that we never had before. The starting point to that, brothers and sisters, is believing. Believing that Jesus will give us that freedom. Believing in him, trusting in him. And as we see in this passage, when we believe, when we show faith, Jesus responds. I can't tell you how he's going to respond, but I can tell you he will respond. Let's take some time to pray, and we'll go ahead and close for today. Let's take some time to just pray into, and again, as I've said, that this is the year of experiencing the gospel of freedom. I want you to just take a moment for you to be shown what does God desire to give you freedom from this year. What difficulty, what trial, what suffering, whether it's something like this woman had, where she dealt with it for many years, or whether it's something very sudden